America is no stranger to protest. From the Boston Tea Party to the Civil Rights Movement, the right to assemble and make one's voice heard is woven into the very fabric of the nation. On April 5, 2025, that right was exercised on a massive scale as millions of Americans took to the streets in all 50 states. This was no ordinary day of action. It was a nationwide roar of defiance, a resounding hands-off, directed at the policies of President Donald Trump and his administration. The hands-off protests, as they came to be known, were sparked by a confluence of anxieties and anger. Trump's return to the Oval Office in January had been met with trepidation by many who feared a rehash of his chaotic first term. Those fears were quickly realized. His administration wasted no time in pushing through an agenda many found alarming, slashing social programs, tightening the screws on immigration, and cozying up to corporate interests. It was a greatest hits compilation of Trump-era policies, only with the volume turned up to 11. The final straw for many was the appointment of Elon Musk, the billionaire CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, as head of the newly formed Department of Government Efficiency. Musk, a self-proclaimed free speech absolutist with a penchant for controversial tweets, quickly made his presence felt. He set about streamlining government operations with the zeal of a Silicon Valley disruptor, leaving a trail of layoffs and program cuts in his wake. To his critics, Musk's appointment was a bridge too far, a blatant example of Trump's willingness to hand over the reins of government to the highest bidder. The hands-off protests were not the work of any single organization. They were a true grassroots uprising, fueled by a diverse coalition of activist groups, concerned citizens, and everyone in between. From seasoned protesters to first-timers, the message was clear. Trump's agenda was not welcome, and the American people would not stand idly by as their rights and livelihoods were dismantled. At the heart of the hands-off protests lay a deep-seated unease about the growing influence of billionaires in American politics. The appointment of Elon Musk to a cabinet position was seen by many as the ultimate manifestation of this trend. Musk, with his vast fortune and libertarian leanings, was viewed as a symbol of a new breed of technocrat, unaccountable to the electorate and more interested in disrupting government than serving the public good. The protesters' concerns about billionaire influence extended beyond Musk. Many saw Trump's policies as being heavily influenced by corporate interests and designed to benefit the wealthy at the expense of the working class. The proposed cuts to social programs like Medicare and Social Security were a particular point of contention, with protesters arguing that these programs were essential lifelines for millions of Americans and should not be sacrificed on the altar of fiscal austerity. The protests tapped into a growing sense of economic anxiety and inequality in the United States. While the stock market soared and the ultra-wealthy saw their fortunes balloon, many ordinary Americans struggled to make ends meet. The COVID-19 pandemic had exacerbated these inequalities, leaving many feeling left behind and forgotten by their government. The hands-off protests were not just about economics, however, they were also a defense of democratic norms and institutions that many felt were under attack. Trump's rhetoric about fake news and his attacks on the judiciary had eroded trust in government and raised fears about the future of American democracy. The protesters saw themselves as drawing a line in the sand, sending a message that they would not tolerate a slide into authoritarianism. The hands-off protests were remarkable for their geographic scope and the sheer diversity of their participants. From major cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, to small towns across the heartland, Americans from all walks of life answered the call to action. Rallies and marches were held in all 50 states, with crowds ranging in size from a few dozen to tens of thousands. The faces in the crowd reflected the multifaceted nature of the protest movement. There were seasoned activists, veterans of the civil rights movement and the anti-war protests of the Vietnam era. There were young people, many of whom were participating in their first ever protest. There were families with children, pushing strollers and carrying homemade signs. There were retirees, worried about the future of Social Security and Medicare. There were immigrants, fearful of being deported. There were members of the LGBTQ+ community, concerned about the rollback of their rights. The voices of the protesters were just as diverse as their backgrounds. On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., Representative Jamie Raskin delivered a fiery speech, comparing the Trump administration to the fascist regimes of Mussolini and Hitler. We've got the right to protest for what is right without being arrested, deported, or fired, Raskin thundered, drawing cheers from the crowd. Across the country in Los Angeles, Representative Maxine Waters addressed a massive rally in Pershing Square. "We will not be silent," Waters declared. "We will not be intimidated. We will resist this administration every step of the way." In New York City, a sea of protesters marched across the Brooklyn Bridge carrying signs with slogans like, "Dump Trump" and "Musk is not my president." Among the marchers was 84-year-old Sue Ann Friedman, who said she was protesting the Trump administration's cuts to medical research funding. "I have Parkinson's disease," Friedman explained. "I'm marching for myself, but I'm also marching for my grandchildren and future generations." The protests were not limited to the United States. In cities across Europe, from London to Berlin to Paris, solidarity demonstrations were held in support of the American protesters. The message was clear: the world was watching, and the fight for democracy in America resonated far beyond its borders. The Trump administration's response to the hands-off protests was a mix of dismissive rhetoric and defiant doubling down on its policies. White House Press Secretary Liz Houston held a press conference where she accused the protesters of being misinformed and manipulated by liberal special interests. Houston denied that the administration was planning to cut Social Security and Medicare, claiming that these programs were safe and secure under President Trump. However, Houston's assurances rang hollow to many who had heard similar promises from Trump in the past, only to see them broken. Moreover, the administration's actions spoke louder than its words. Just days after the protests, Musk announced a new round of layoffs at the Social Security Administration, claiming that the agency was bloated and inefficient. The move was seen by many as a direct rebuke to the protesters and a sign that the Trump administration had no intention of changing course. The hands-off protests presented the Trump administration with a major challenge. The protests demonstrated the depth of opposition to Trump's agenda and the willingness of millions of Americans to take to the streets to make their voices heard. However, it remained to be seen whether the protests would be enough to force the administration to change course, or whether they would simply harden the resolve of Trump and his allies. The protests also highlighted the growing divide in American society. The country seemed more polarized than ever, with little common ground between the two sides. The hands-off protests were a stark reminder that the battle for the soul of America was far from over. It was a battle that would be fought not just in the halls of power but also in the streets, in the media, and in the hearts and minds of the American people.